It's quite easy to forget that the Austin Powers movies were as popular as they were these days, I think. They were hugely popular in the later part of the 90s and early 2000s, but you don't really see people talking about them now. What I find really uncomfortable is that we're rapidly coming up to a date removed from the first movie's release that matches the same amount of time that Powers and Dr. Evil were frozen for. And the jokes in the films are largely about the secret agent and his bald nemesis and how outdated their attitudes and points of reference are. Have I become Austin Powers due to my age? There are talks ongoing about a fourth Austin Powers movie, which will undoubtedly make light of how things are different since the 90s, and I will no longer be giggling about how daft old people were in their youth and will instead start fearing for my own death. Surely the feeling a blockbuster movie comedy is aiming for is haw-haws and geroscophobia. That's the fear of getting old. But yes, the Austin Powers movies were great fun and extremely popular. The first movie, Austin Powers International Man of Mystery, made $68 million in 1997 from an $18 million budget, which made it a modest hit. But word of mouth and a very, very strong home video performance saw the sequels 1999's The Spy Who Shagged Me and 2002's Gold Member perform incredibly well, scoring a massive $312 million and $296 million in ticket sales respectively. The trio of 60s James Bond spoofs weren't nearly as loved by the critics though. A 73% score on critic rating aggregator Rotten Tomatoes for the first film is the highest attained by the series. Mike Myers' daft comedy timing and writing honed on Saturday Night Live and the Wayne's World movies are used to great effect here, certainly better than The Love Guru and The Cat in the Hat anyway. He plays multiple roles in the series and has a whale of a time doing so, particularly as the goofy despot Dr. Evil. Both Austin and Dr. Evil are given equal screen time, which might help explain why each character is given a Game Boy Color title each, released at the same time. Both games, Austin Powers' Oh Behave and Dr. Evil's Welcome to My Underground Lair, were coded by Rockstar's Game Boy programming arm Tarantula Studios, who are also responsible for the previously covered Game Boy Color titles Jim Henson's Muppets and Evel Knievel. More on Evel Knievel a little bit later on. For the most part, the two games are largely identical, with different themes and graphics depending on which game you bought, which cover star you preferred. The main hub of the game is an operating system based around a simplified version of whatever the operating systems were at the time, Windows 2000 say, complete with visuals and jokes related to each one of the characters. Dr. Evil's interface is an industrial-looking affair in its look with muted greys, purples and greens, whereas Austin's is full of faux summer of love colours and swirly things, or at least the nearest that the Game Boy Color is capable of. It may be called the Game Boy Color, it's not the most colourful. If you so wish, you can change most aspects of this user interface. Colours, pointers and backdrops can be changed around and swapped about. Also featured are numerous office programs like a calculator and the most cumbersome and rudimentary word processor in human history. You have to scroll up and down to find the letter you want. I'm struggling to see what the point of this is, though it does have link-up play, so you could potentially very slowly type emails to another person who owns the game, who's sitting over the other side of the room for you, connected to a link cable. I mean, you could. It is very bizarre having a personal organiser Game Boy cartridge game, but it's not the first one I've seen. There was a ET themed one that I covered many moons ago. A really strange idea, but perhaps it was developers noticing that a lot of these features were appearing on Nokias of the time and they wanted to pretend that they were all relevant and hip, baby, yeah! There's reference that, innit? Other features include a way to access a mock-up version of the internet, which lets you access the information about the then two movies, as the game was released in 2000. It was a good 2 years before Gold Member's release. The information here is pretty thin. It was sort of like what you would find on a simplified IMDb, with cast and a full synopsis of the films. It is a strange package, really. It even has like a fake DOS that comes up with lots of jokes before the Windows loads in. A time capsule, a spoof of a time capsule. Interestingly, there were another 2 games planned, with the back of the box mentioning their existence. Why Make Millions was to feature Mini-Me on the cover, whereas Yeah Baby Yeah featured the objects of Austin's unwanted and then wanted attention, Felicity Shagwell and Vanessa Kensington. Both these titles featured the same PDA-style user interface and were probably cancelled due to the poor reception, both from critics and commercial sales, of the released pair of titles. These 2 games have leaked on the internet since, but we'll just stick to the 2 released titles for today. GameSpot interviewed Dan Houser of Rockstar Games before the game's release, and they seem to have quite big plans for the Austin Powers license, with titles being prepped for all of the major formats, both out and coming out. Other than the 2 Game Boy Color games mentioned, the one that got furthest along was an Austin Powers kart racer called Mojo Rally, which was quite late in development for the Dreamcast. Nothing transpired in the end, save for the games we're about to cover though. Back to the Game Boy Color titles, and let's talk about the actual gameplay hidden beyond this rather domineering and questionable presentation of the PDA. Both games feature 3 rather basic titles that are shared between the games, and they also feature 1 game unique to each title too. Let's have a look at the shared titles first. Do you remember the worst bit of Alex Kidd? You know, the Janken, or rock, paper, scissors as we're more likely to call it. That's here as an entirely separate game. Yay, a game based entirely on rock, paper, scissors. What a rollicking start. Your cover star and a Dr. Evil henchman of your choice do battle with a hand gesture guessing game, complete with well-drawn but very low animation caricatures. You can decide which gesture you're going to do and then hit fire once the light goes green. Too early or too late and you lose. If you beat him, that's 1 point to you, and it's a best of 3. That's all I've got to say on that. Domination is just Othello, with the 2 main characters barking out catchphrases after each move. Difficulty can be changed in this game should you wish to make the Othello game on your Austin Powers themed Game Boy cartridge a little bit more difficult. I mean, you might. What this has got to do with Austin Powers, I don't know. Did they play a lot of Othello in the 60s? Probably. They didn't have video games. Mojo Maze is a Pac-Man variant featuring a chibi version of your selected game's cover star, with larger maps that you unlock passages through to once you've collected all of the icons that your character prefers throughout the stage. Each area has its own visually distinct villains, which is a nice touch, from ladies' underwear to vultures. And there's multiple of these large maps to clear, so it is at least something video gamey, even though I'm not particularly a fan of Pac-Man variants where the screen scrolls. The cartridge-specific distinct games and meat of each title, if you will, and at first I didn't realise that these existed. You actually have to scroll down while in the game's folder to find them. I was convinced that these games were identical, barring a few cosmetic tweaks and very little in the way of gameplay, until I saw some screenshots while doing research. It's madness, isn't it? I wonder if people who originally purchased the games missed out on the main part of them because the designers were committed to this whole PDA aesthetic. And what's really bad about them is they're not actually mini games, they're actually full-ass games. Like, there are long plays of these on YouTube that last multiple hours, and they're hidden almost. A very strange choice for me. Oh Behave was a straight-up Game Boy Color platform game called International Man in a Platform Game. I quite like that title. It's very Ron Seal. And how does it play? Well, it's a straight-up, bona fide Euro platformer, pumped to the gills with collectibles, Jet Set Willy-style platform jumps, and antagonistic objects come to life. What more do you want from a Euro platformer except a gradient sky? And as it's set in London, it's even more Euro platformery than ever. Look at all these English things trying to kill me, like a policeman's helmet and a football. It straight up looks and plays like a later budget title on an Amstrad CPC, and it's entirely up to your personal preference on whether that's a good thing or not. For me, it's perfectly adequate. One bugbear would be it's not always possible to kill an opponent on some of the tiny platforms due to them being bullet sponges. They kill you before you can fill them full of lead. Other than that, it's fine. It's challenging, and it plays a lot like that Muppets platformer that I reviewed some time back. Absolutely nothing fancy, graphics are bang average, it's a Euro platformer. You may enjoy it, you may not. Welcome to My Underground Layer doesn't have a Euro platformer, but instead we've got something entirely different. Listen to the name of the title, or look at it on the screen if you prefer. Dr. Evil, Ink and Evil. And yeah, this is starting to look very familiar. Remember I said I'd get back to Evil Knievel? Well, they're not hiding it very well, are they? Not by that title. Tarantula have reused the same engine on their Evil Knievel game. It is very close indeed. It's a shorter version of that game, but it is the Evil Knievel game. And as you can see, it's a Kickstart 2 style game with twitchy controls, starring the villainous professor and his pint-sized clone cohort Mini-Me. Don't speed, don't do unnecessary over-the-top spins in the air, and make your way across these platformed levels till you get to the finish line. I found Evil Knievel a bit too tricky for my tastes, and the same applies here. It's interesting, but it's not really for me. Too tricksy and unforgiving, but if you like trial-style games that are very difficult, it might well be your cup of warm coffee. In case you're wondering, the main games on the unreleased Yeah Baby Yeah and Why Make Millions were a top-down Shaguar driving game and a jetpack controlling Dr. Evil and Mini-Me venture. They were alright from the look of them, I didn't play them. CMVG reviewed the pair of released titles back in September of 2000. They said that the humour is strong, but you'll soon see and hear it all very quickly, while the mini-games are fun, but way too simple. They gave it a 3 out of 5. We would have to wait a further 2 years for the next Austin Powers video game, and that came out via Take-Two's budget arm called Gotham Software, leading me to believe that Rockstar Games just pushed their license to one of their smaller stablemates due to the hammering both commercially and critically that the 2 Game Boy titles got. Then why not make use of the license? After all, New Line were putting out a new movie, Goldmember, in that year, so all they had to do was dust off the old license and then look to make a quick buck out of people that were aware of a thing that was in the cinema. The PlayStation 1, of course, was no longer the preeminent console, but had become home to a lot of budget titles for those who existed only on pocket money. And yep, as the title suggests, it's a video pinball game. And these can go one of 2 ways. They can either be very creative, see things like Devil Crush, making full use of the console and its fantastical elements, so you can have little figures walking around that you can hit, or they're just straight up recreations of pinball, and this is the latter. It's a fairly flat budget pinball title made by the same people that made the similarly plain Jane Kiss Pinball, and they are the team at Australian coding house Wildfire Studios. And just like the Kiss title, there's not a lot to say about this game. There are 2 tables, neither of them is brilliantly designed even by real pinball game standards. They're based on the then released 2 cinematic capers, with the first table, I would say, being the more playable of the 2. Is it worth it for a tenner? Yeah, probably, but not even remotely a good use of the license or a game that you'll be coming back to. There's not really anything else I can say about it. You can see what it looks like. It's a video pinball title with a bit of Austin Powers trimming on it. There's nothing really spectacular to say about it. PSX Nation gave it a 49% back in April 2003, and that's about right for it. It's worth about a tenner, no more than that. So that's the Austin Powers games that came out. And I'm nearing towards saying that Dr. Evil should shoot him with his big frickin' laser than Austin Powers saying they're pretty groovy, yeah, because they're not. And that's the end of that. So what shall we talk about next time? How about Hagar the Horrible? Vikings, hurrah! Like, subscribe, and Kay, thanks, bye.